Life is all about relationships. Lovers, family, body, or money. How satisfied you are can be completely explained by how you relate to things around you. This is Sophie Jaffe, and together with my husband, Dr. Adi Jaffe, we are here to explore and teach you how to maximize your relationships and achieve a happier life. Let's get ignited.
Thanks to Chosen Foods for supporting the Ignited podcast. Chosen Foods is a health food company with a focus on real, nourishing food. They offer a variety of healthy fats, plant-based proteins, and ancient superfoods.
You know, I love that. I love Chosen Foods because of their 100% pure coconut oil spray. It's so versatile. I can add it to sauteed veggies, to my scrambled eggs, or anything else. They have no harmful propellants or emulsifiers. They're making healthy cooking and eating an absolute breeze, which is exactly what I need with 3 kids and a husband who barely cooks. Okay, breakfast and maybe one other meal a week.
Thank you for that. All you got to do to get our special discount is head to chosenfoods.com/IGNTD Ignited and use the promo code Ignited50 during checkout for 50% off your order, people.
That is a lot of discount for some amazing, amazing oils.
Get some Chosen Foods. Hello and welcome to this episode of the Ignited podcast. I'm Adi Jaffe.
I'm Sophie Jaffe.
And we're talking about hormones.
Hormones, holla.
We have such an amazing expert on today. I can't wait for you all to listen to the conversation that I unfortunately had to have alone because Sophie was working.
Yeah, I was working. Yeah. Such a bummer.
Busy lazing around, but you would have loved this conversation.
Yeah, I'm so excited to listen to it with you guys.
Yeah. And we talked a lot about the role of hormones and then shifts in our environment and food and medications and toxins and all this stuff related to, I always looked at it from the neuroscience point of view because I studied neuroscience. She's a physician focused on hormones. And so she looks at it as how it affects the endocrine system. And what we got into that was really intense and really deep that I didn't really expect to get into at all in a conversation with a physician about hormones was women's role in society in general and patriarchal nature of the world we live in where, a really interesting point, you'll hear about this more in the interview too, but we talked about the pill and you and I have had a lot of conversations about the pill. You decided not to go back on an IUD or the pill after this pregnancy.
I'm sure many women can relate, but I've spent the better part of my adult years, almost all of them, on some sort of birth control.
Totally. And
I'm done. I've had 3 babies. I don't want to be manipulated by some external force.
Here's the crazy part is when the pill first came out, it was seen as this powerful force for liberating women because women were just having babies left and right beforehand and had no choice.
Exactly.
And all of a sudden they got choice. But the point Dr. Gersh makes about the pill is, it gave women choice, but it gave them choice by stopping their natural biological process.
Exactly.
And
I completely agree.
Men didn't have to fuck with their biological process for women to have choice.
Yeah.
It was women.
I think it's more about, at this point, in this day and age, it's about knowledge is power, knowing your body is power, track your cycles, take your temperature, whatever works for you for your own birth control, but it's a brilliant system that's already built in. If you know your body and you get to know it and your own cycles and rhythms, you can have natural birth control methods.
Yeah, in the meditation and mindfulness kind of podcast we talk about how unaware people are oftentimes about just about everything they do. But
but get educated.
No, totally. But
I'm not saying you should already know these things inherently. I have to get to know my body all over again every time. I don't even have my cycle right now because I just had Noah 3.5 months ago and I'm exclusively breastfeeding. So I might not get my period for a year or so. So I will have to get to know my rhythms and all over again and start tracking my period. But I'm more than happy to do that and get to know my cycles and rhythms and when I'm ovulating and then, be smart about that.
Totally.
Unless you get snipped and then we can be a little less careful. But even then,
we know couples.
Yeah, knowing us, we'll still get pregnant on that. So you have to be mindful and get to know your own body.
Yeah, totally. So, we got into this really intense conversation about just the role of birth control and the expectations. And I mean, we talk a lot about hormones and how they changed you. I mean, when you first got the IUD, your body had to adjust. And then
didn't I get kind of depressed?
I mean, you definitely changed. I remember that for sure.
I feel like I got a little depressed, which would make sense because I also do that every pregnancy.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then the IUD is essentially faking your body in some way into thinking that you're pregnant all the time in a way.
And pills are too.
So she talked a lot and really specific about kind of what the pill really does, which is really interesting. But what you mentioned to me before we went on is that we really almost as soon as the moment you got pregnant. So we talked, for those of you who don't know, and we haven't really talked about this journey much, but Noah, who is staring lovingly into Sophie's eyes right now as she's feeding. Noah was something, Sophie, that you wanted for like 5 years.
Yeah.
You started talking about it really as soon as you found out you were pregnant with Leo, because you always wanted a girl. Mm-hmm. And so that was kind of right there. But then we had Leo and it took some time. And about a year later, though, you really started talking about it. And I was not in.
Yeah.
And so it took a few years for things to calm down enough for me to be kind of ready to have another baby. Mm-hmm. But you wanted her forever. And yet, like, the moment you got pregnant, what you reminded me right before is that it created this gap between us, but you changed. Mm-hmm. And I think in the context of this conversation, we recognize the power of hormones alone, the biological change to create that. So can you talk a little bit about what it felt like?
Yeah, I was just saying to Adi before this episode started, like, oh my gosh, we're going to talk about hormones? Hello. Like, I just got out of the most important case study of my life, which is pregnancy. Like, pregnancy is a case study in hormones, how they affect you, your mood, your body, your emotions, everything. And psychologically, I am so sensitive to hormones that the minute I take a pregnancy test, first of all, before I even take a pregnancy test, I know I'm pregnant because I start feeling different. And as the hormones increase and as those, like in this case, and as the estrogen levels increased, I became more and more depressed. My food cravings changed. Foods that I absolutely love, like nut butter, chocolate, smoothies, like all my go-to foods every damn day. Coffee. I didn't want any of them. You couldn't even have them near me without me feeling somewhat sick.
Yeah.
And that's all hormones. Nothing else changed. There's nothing else. And you
became a completely different human being.
And in every way, that's just like one small example is my food cravings.
We talk about the eating all the time because eating is such an important part of what you do and how you talk to people and your social media stuff and all that. So everybody knows how you eat. But like, I remember one of the reasons we talked about this before in the social media podcast. One of the reasons why you kind of left trying to be so strict about how you do social media was when you got pregnant and you weren't fucking drinking smoothies.
I wasn't drinking smoothies. I wasn't working out like that. I didn't feel good. I didn't feel positive, and I felt like I was lying to my community online. To my peeps. Like, I'm not going to put a fucking smoothie bowl up when I want to throw up in it. Like, absolutely not.
That would be a bad picture.
I'm going to talk about literally I was in the parking lot in my car eating a bagel on my Instagram stories, chatting about how I had to have that bagel because I was pregnant. And it's just reality.
And it's funny, like every pregnancy you have different food cravings, but I feel like this one, like there might've been a personality change in the other ones as well. But it was our first baby and we were going through so much other shit back then. Like you hated me for really solid reasons back then. So I don't know if that was part of the thing. Mm-hmm. Second pregnancy, I don't feel like it was as intense.
I didn't have time to even
working full time,
be affected by it. Yeah.
This one created real distance. Like we had a real hard time kind of reconnecting.
Well, I felt it real hard. Like these hormones were no joke. Like I'm assuming it's because it was a girl and it was more estrogen, but it threw me for a loop. Like I was off my rocker. And for the entire 9 months, I did not feel myself. Yeah. I isolated. I was really depressed. I didn't want to talk to my friends. I usually like my best friends who live all over the world, like have a 1 hour, 2 hour chat to like catch up. I didn't talk to any of them. I didn't want to talk to anyone. I just wanted to isolate, be alone, get through it. I was like a mama bear in my den, just storing up for winter, making this baby. And It was hormone related, 100%.
Yeah. I mean, it was a really massive shift in just how you are. And it's kind of funny, right? I mean, any partners listening right now, there are things you talk to your partner about and things, and this will relate back to our tip later on today, but some things that you just know, like you can just feel on a very deep level are really out of your control. Like a conversation is not going to get you through them. And it was easy to mark this one because I knew you were pregnant. So I knew there was a reason why it was happening.
Sure.
It was kind of tough to
It's hard to
be
stay
around
in that
somebody.
mindset.
Well, because it's kind of not your partner, right? Like for this limited amount of time, because of the biology that they're going through and because of all the changes that you went through, Soph, it's like you weren't really the same person.
Right. And it's actually not a limited amount of time. It's almost a year of being in that state. It's not like when I stopped getting sick every day and throwing up every day, which was also hormone related.
6 months in.
5.5 some months. It's still another 3.5 months of being miserable and not being myself. Happy. I emotionally was not myself. It's just really interesting. And it really was all hormonal because the minute she came out of my body, I felt better. That dark cloud left that had been looming over me for 9 months.
You had that ear infection, which made it fun and exciting, and you were in pain.
I'm not even going to talk about that because it just has nothing to do with what I'm trying to say here. What I'm trying to say is I felt energetically, even with an ear infection that brought me so much pain, I felt energetically, psychologically, spiritually a lift. I felt more positive. I immediately felt inspired again. I was texting my friends that work for different all these project ideas. I was re-inspired, reinvigorated. I was so lit up again and ignited because she was out of my body and those hormones had changed and shifted. Right.
And just to be fair, that was your experience. Some women have the exact opposite, right? They're happy and joyous while pregnant, and then they have a flip into deep depression.
And that's hormones.
No, I get it. I'm just saying that was your experience was this lifting.
But also immediately started craving those foods again. It felt so good to feel like myself, to go grab a spoon and eat out of the nut butter jar, which is partially how I define myself, let's be honest, nut butter on repeat. But I mean, really though, it's these foods that I love, you do kind of relate to yourself in certain ways based on cravings and the way you feel and your sleep and your mood. And my disposition was not Sophie. It was someone else. And it was crazy how intense it was.
Yeah.
And that's hormones.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm excited to hear this conversation.
And I think it's important. The relationship that we wanted to leave here for today is we talk a lot about tools, about psychological tools and behavioral tools and mindfulness and meditation and all these wonderful things. And they're all great. But I do think we also have to acknowledge the power of biology and that there are events like stressors that happen in your outside world, but then also things like pregnancy or menopause or puberty, all these other events that happen in life that cause massive changes in your hormones and your biology, and therefore massive changes in how you feel and how you interact with the world. And so if you see a big shift, if something big has shifted in your person, some of it may be behavioral and something that they're doing, but some of it may be biological. And I think it's important for people sometimes to recognize that because that's how you're able to go and get checked and identified, and identify what it is that's going on. I was waking up tired for 2-3 years and we couldn't figure out what it was. And we kept trying all these different things. And eventually I have no idea why they didn't test for it initially, but that Hashimoto's thing came back and I was like, oh, it's thyroid.
Hormones.
That has to do with hormones. And so it's that was really hard for me for years, waking up in the morning, and I never woke up like that. I didn't feel it that well. I'm starting up again, by the way, which is, I really have to get into the diet part of this, and we'll have Alyssa on again to talk about that specifically because I think that's important. But sometimes because we don't see our biology and we don't have meters. It's not like on your forehead there's a meter of this is how much cortisol you have right now. This is how much adrenaline you have. Oh, it's gone down. We think it's all behavioral. Sometimes it's your biology. And, in this conversation, we get really deeply into how taking the pill, how being on birth control, how eating certain toxins can really affect who you are as a person on the cellular level. And so we talk about food, we talk about water, we talk about all these other things in this podcast. Be aware. I mean, substance use, right? I talk a lot to my people about substance use, but everything from, I mean, part of the reason why you like masturbating to porn, if that's your thing, is because of the hormonal release and the neurotransmitter release that it creates. Become aware of how your interaction with the world affects your biology, because that's going to play a huge role in addition to everything else we talk about.
So excited to hear this.
All right. So hold on. We're going to leave you here for a minute with some excitement. If you haven't checked out the relationship course, or if you know somebody who's struggling with addiction, then go to ignitedrecovery.com. And we're not quite ready for it yet, and it's going to be a little while, but I want to tell people that you're working on a postpartum course that we are really excited
It's going to be amazing
to talk about. It's going to be so fun. So hold on to that, and we will see you on the flip side.
Bye. This episode of the Ignited podcast is brought to you by Philosophy Superfoods. The Philosophy offers cleanses and other nutritional products that are unlike any of the other supplements and detoxification programs on the market. Why? Because they actually nourish the body with whole, live, nutrient-rich foods instead of depriving you and leaving you hungry. Have you ever tried a cleanse only to find out that you can't make it through a whole day because you're starving? Ever try a superfood shake that made you nauseous because it was so disgusting you'd rather not eat? The Philosophy fix all that with a simple set of offerings that load up your body with nutrients while actually tasting good. Makes sense, right? Each of the Philosophy superfood and protein blends is vegan, raw, gluten-free, and has absolutely no filler ingredients. With over 15,000 satisfied customers, including some of the world's biggest celebrities like George Clooney, Gerard Butler, Lea Michele, and over 10 years of experience, this is the best stuff you can get. To buy some or find out more info, go to our website, thephilosophy.com.
All right, everybody, welcome back to the conversation part of today's Ignited episode. I hope you had a nice break there. We are here today with a very, very special guest, Dr. Felice Gersh, who is, we're going to cover a lot regarding health in general, but primarily women's health in this specific episode. I feel like we could have you on multiple times to talk about so many different topics. But why don't you introduce yourself to our listeners a little bit, maybe what your expertise is, but also how you got here.
Well, I have been practicing medicine for several decades. And I started back when I was primarily focused on doing a lot of deliveries and surgery. So I was a very conventional doctor. But even back when I began in the 1980s in my practice, I knew that there was more to health than just prescribing drugs and doing surgery. So from the very get-go, I had a Chinese medicine practitioner in my office. I had a massage therapist, a cognitive behavioral therapist, nutritionist. So I had, at one point, I had a biofeedback specialist. So I always had what I called my ancillaries, because I knew that it took a village to really help people to maintain health, to regain health. Sure. But then back a little over a decade ago, it was my time to give up obstetrics after many, many sleepless nights over, like I mentioned, decades. And it was really destroying my health. As much as I loved it, I had to stop. And after I stopped, I had maybe a little more sleep, and I took a pause, and I had all these pharmaceutical reps that were parading through my office on a regular basis. And for the first time in my career, I made them show me the studies. I said, show me exactly what studies you did as a company to get your drug approved by the FDA. And what I found was very disturbing for me, because I found that often they inflated these graphs so that very tiny differences from placebo looked very dramatic. When you looked at it, it was very nominal. For example, there were drugs for what they called overactive bladder that we were being really pressured to prescribe and diagnose all these women with overactive bladder. But it turned out when you gave these drugs, you actually maybe reduced the number of bathroom visits by 1 in 24 hours. Right. And for that, you got a drug that increased your risk of dry mouth, which is very bad for your health, as well as chronic constipation, and even increased the risk of dementia. So this didn't really seem like a good kind of a way to go. And I didn't know what to do, because as I looked at each pharmaceutical, it was like not very good. And the array of side effects was so huge. So I had sort of a middle-aged mental health crisis in my own practice,
Okay.
and I went on a search. I went looking for answers for what could I do to help my patients, because this really wasn't enough. And I started looking at it. It was really what we now call pill to the ill. You know, you have this symptom, take this pill. You have this symptom, and it's like, well, wait a minute. You're not really curing anything. You're just piling up the pharmaceuticals in this person. So I started taking courses with naturopathic doctors and functional medicine doctors, but I had no real direction. I had no real mentor. So I ended up one time in Portland at a conference for naturopathic doctors. And one of the doctors who was giving a lecture happened to be an MD. And I went up to her afterwards, and her name is Dr. Lodog. She was the director at that time of the Fellowship in Integrative Medicine at the University of Arizona School of Medicine. And I went up to her and I said, you and I are the only MDs in this entire room, and I am totally lost. I don't know what to do. I don't know how to help my patients anymore, and I don't really have a clear path. She said, in 2 weeks, we start a new class in the fellowship. I'm talking to you. I know you're qualified. Why don't you apply and come? So I went home. That night I applied. 2 weeks later, I was in Tucson, and I did the 2-year fellowship in integrative medicine, which I finished in 2012. And since then, it's been a whirlwind of taking additional courses and learning, like never stopping and relearning and learning things that never were even discovered when I was back in medical school. So relearning pathways and all about biochemistry and cell biology, so that I really could try to be very evidence-based. Everything I do, I try to be very scientific and evidence-based. And I started doing a lot of speaking and writing. And so now I am on the faculty at the University of Arizona School of Medicine in the fellowship. I help to write the module for women's health. I educate and lecture the students there, and I correct their final exams, which are big case studies. And so I'm part of this world. I can't look back. And I've expanded what I call my therapeutic toolbox to incorporate so much more than just pharmaceuticals and surgery. Now I incorporate all kinds of things with nutrition and lifestyle, working with sleep, and of course, mind-body medicine, understanding the impact of mood and stress on overall health. And I've looked at microbiomes all over the body, and the circadian rhythm, the impact that we can have with herbals, for example, as opposed to pharmaceuticals, which we call sort of green medicine, like looking for alternatives when you need to treat. So I incorporate acupuncture and massage therapy still. So I just have a bigger toolbox to try to help people and try to get to the root cause of illness, not just try to patch things up as we go.
That's awesome. I love big toolboxes, and I love approaches that don't try to deal with the symptoms, or while dealing with the symptoms, at least try to address the underlying issues. So it's funny, I come from an MFM family. We joke, maternal and fetal medicine. We joke in my family that I ended up being the other doctor because I went and got a PhD instead of an MD, which my father and my sister, my sister still is, but my father was when he was still alive. So I know very well the life of obstetrics and gynecology experts who are kind of at the beck and call of life, right? Literally, as life enters the world, you got to be there. So kudos on doing all that work for years. But I feel like you touched on so many subjects that I love and I think would be amazing to discuss further. One of which by itself is just the idea of, I finally had time to actually look at the research behind the things that I was prescribing and taking myself maybe, and seeing that things aren't always what they seem once you start looking behind the curtain, if you will.
That's right. And it was really quite a revelation, because I came into the world of medicine at the very same time that big pharma's kind of exploded, and it was like the blockbuster drug of the month. So I saw them coming out down the pipeline, but I also saw what was happening as one by one, many of these pharmaceuticals got black box warnings. Some of them were taken off of the market because they were found to increase mortality and terrible morbidity. So I saw the good and the bad. But when everything first came out, I was what you might call an early adapter. I mean, I wanted to be so cutting edge. I wanted to be able to do everything right as it came out. So every medical device, like, oh, this new medical instrument for surgery, I would want to use, like, they had lasers and morcellators. I mean, I was like the first out the block, and I was teaching.
You're trying to do obstetrics with orthoscopic surgery.
Yes, I would like spend my mornings doing gynecological surgery and my nights doing deliveries. It was pretty nonstop. But it was really disconcerting to say the least, to really see how little efficacious properties these pharmaceuticals had, and yet the array of side effects. And I also lived during the time in the heyday of big pharma when they were doing things that now they are not getting away with, which was promoting off-label use of pharmaceuticals. Right. Like in the healthcare arena, like there were certain drugs like Zyprexa, which I'm sure you've heard of, and so on, which it was for bipolar. But they would come to my office, and I'm a gynecologist, and they'd say, here's a 5-question list. You just ask your patients these 5 questions, and if 3 of them are positive, you should prescribe Zyprexa. It's
there
like,
you go.
Exactly. That's, why would you want to do a residency in psychiatry? All you need is these 5 questions.
5 questions.
That's
handed
it.
to you by the manufacturer of the drug.
Yes. And it was
there's no bias. There's no bias there.
No. And it was for many off-label. It's like, wow, you can use this for so many things. So there was so much off-label promotion of pharmaceuticals. So I saw the dark side, a lot of the dark side.
Well, and I think one of the things that you're mentioning that is really important for people to understand, because, we're in this age right now where holistic care is fashionable and it's getting more and more coverage, et cetera. We had Dr. Frank Lipman on as one of our first episodes. I don't know if you know Dr. Lipman or not.
Well, I know of him.
Yeah. And so it was really interesting to have him on and get the perspective, like you were talking about having an acupuncturist on early on, et cetera. We are exiting, I feel like in the last 5 to 10 years, we're exiting the age of not just big pharma, but kind of like big science, right? So with the idea that we're going to get our best discoveries out of labs, essentially. And so for years in medicine and self-care in general, the idea was man-made molecules, man-made chemicals, man-made drugs are going to provide better outcome than their herbal counterparts because they're more focused. So essentially, like we took a tree bark that people have been chewing on for years to reduce inflammation. Mm-hmm. We took out the aspirin from it, and we said, here's a pill. You don't have to chew on an herbal medicine because we identified the specific sub-ingredient. Mm-hmm. And you mentioned this really well in what you were talking about. I think we got lost because we were so reductionist. We ended up getting lost between primary effects and side effects. And I love this point that you made about, a drug that is supposed to maybe help incontinence or something, and it reduces somebody's urine, like trips to the bathroom by 1 trip, but yet it has a laundry list of side effects. And one of the ones that you mentioned, let's say dry mouth, if people don't really understand the relationship between their microbiome and the bacteria they have in their body, et cetera, then maybe peeing less does seem like it's better compared to having dry mouth if you don't really understand how everything works together. And I think what I love about the Ignited podcast in general is we try to address the relationships, because in the end, none of these things are isolated. That's what we're learning is when you treat inflammation inappropriately, you're actually stopping the body from engaging in an entire process that is meant to keep it healthier over time. And so a lot of times the primary effect you're trying to get is actually not a good primary effect. You should actually, it's almost like you have to figure out how to deal with enough discomfort so that your body gets to do what it needs to do while also keeping yourself comfortable enough to live and thrive, et cetera.
I totally agree. And I talk about this all the time, is that we are certainly not smart enough to micromanage the human body by trying to impact individual enzyme pathways. So first of all, everything is more complex. So like I see doctors and they're trying to even micromanage like estrogen receptors, because that's one of my areas of expertise is hormones. And they want to give like estriol rather than estradiol but they don't even really understand that estriol only works on the beta receptor of estrogen, which is very important, but it's one receptor and there's such an interplay. That's the complexity of the human body. So if you have a lot of beta, you actually downregulate alpha. And they think, well, that's good. We hate alpha. Of course you don't hate alpha. Alpha is the primary estrogen receptor on the innate immune cells. So you want to downregulate your innate immune cells so you can't fight an infection because, of course, I was thinking about that when you talked about inflammation. Inflammation is what saves us from dying of bacteria getting into our bodies and viruses. Right. That's one of the problems with the drugs. That's the reaction for most autoimmune diseases now are treated with drugs that block the innate immune system so that you can't make these inflammatory cytokines, like interleukins and tumor necrosis factor alpha, like they're evil, But the problem is, if you read the fine print, it says, but you might die of an infection. You might get cancer, like leukemia or lymphoma, because these are innate mechanisms in our bodies to regulate so many things. And we now know our immune system is so much more than fighting off a cold. It's like an interconnectivity and it links to the brain and it's like communication system. So we are doing so much potential harm. So we have to get to, like you mentioned, root causes and not just take down different parts of our immune system on a regular basis.
And what a great metaphor I believe, for life in general, right? Where, we just had with a recent guest, we just had a similar conversation where when all you do is try to address the discomfort at a symptomatic level, what you're missing is that there's an entire, if you kind of use the iceberg analysis, right? You're addressing the one thing is happening. So my skin is coming out in rashes, or I'm not sleeping as well as I need to, or I'm in pain because, I got some inflammation in my knee or something along those lines. And by trying to address that single element of your existence, what you're missing a lot of times is the impact you're having on so many other systems in your body. And I don't know how we got to this place. I mean, and it's not just in medicine. Medicine is definitely an example of it because you have these experts who tell you, well, this is what you have to do. This is the action that will fix you, but they're looking at it from their specific vantage point, right? They want to fix the single problem that is their expertise. Having somebody who's not holistically aware means that they're not paying attention to what their action might do on all the other systems. Instead, they're saying, oh, I can fix your leg. And they might fix your leg, but in the process end up destroying, cascades of systems that will end up causing you, I don't know, arthritis down the line, or, cause you other debilitating issues that will be exacerbated much, much further down the line, but were kind of even maybe started by not paying attention to the right thing in the beginning. And obviously one of the biggest examples is not addressing like fluid intake and the food that you take on before trying to fix the inflammation, right? Because there are that inflammation is happening for some reason. It's a signal to your body.
I use that with the menstrual cycle, getting back to my root business, which is women's health. And the menstrual cycle is a vital sign of a woman's health status. Just like pain is a sign, it's a signal, right? You don't want to just cover up the pain. You want to know what's going on. But the menstrual cycle now in so many women, very young women throughout the whole reproductive life, is often very abnormal. I mean, women have complaints of bad cramps and PMS, and they have, irregular cycles, a lot more infertility. And the reflex, the knee-jerk reflex in all of medicine, and OBGYNs, my background, we're on board certified, is to just give birth control pills. And they say, these are hormones that are going to regulate you. They are not hormones. Number one, it's really important that birth control pills be recognized for what they are. There's not a hormone to be found in a single birth control pill. They're all endocrine disruptors, and they're recognized as such on the NIH websites for toxicology.
I think that's a great lesson. Do you mind? I mean, let's dive into that. A lot of the people, I think about 60% of our listeners are women. They have had menstrual cycles at some point in their life. They're either dealing with this or have dealt with it. Can you explain the difference? Because the birth control pill was seen as a revolution in women's rights and the change in so many aspects of the life of a woman. Let's dig in a little bit to what is actually happening in that process.
So if we talk about birth control pills, I think it is like you said, it was considered revolutionary that women can control their reproductive futures, right? They don't have to have babies when they're not ready. And I'm certainly not in favor of women having babies when they're not ready. But when birth control pills came into existence, we're talking about like 60 years ago now, is when they were first devised. No one knew anything about what estrogen did in the body. They really did not. They didn't know we had different receptors. Nobody knew about the circadian rhythm. Nobody knew like a fraction of what we now know. And reproduction was looked, and it still is looked at in our medical world as a completely separate function from the rest of a woman's body. So I look at it like this, like you have a car, you go to buy a new car, and at the end, when you're going to make your deal, they say, by the way, we have this really nice sporty package. You can get the special hubcaps and the grill work, and you get the special metallic finish on your paint job. But the car will run the same. So it's a take it or leave it thing. And that's kind of how reproduction in women is looked at. You know, take it or leave it. It's just tacked on like the extra sporty package. But really, reproduction is like the transmission. So you can't buy a car and say, you know, I think I'll just leave out the transmission because, you know, I'll save money or I don't really want a transmission. No, you kind of have to have that. Reproduction is the prime directive of the female body. You can like it or not. That's how we evolved. In fact, that's the prime directive of all life forms, is to reproduce and to survive, to reproduce and to raise the young. And if you don't need to raise the young, then nobody cares about you either. There are creatures that lay their eggs and then that's the end for them, right? So, but for humans, it goes on longer. But reproduction is not a separate package. It's completely interlinked with every function in the female body. And estrogen is the master hormone of it all.
And
estrogen is the master.
And so part of what I'm hearing you saying, and please just, I'd love to go deeper into this. But part of what you're saying is when we interfere, when we alter that system, that primary drive, and God knows I'm going to want to talk about that in a minute, because there will be, you know, this has been deeply driven into the female psyche and the male psyche, right? This idea of controlling this primary drive versus letting it drive you, which is what I'm hearing you saying is kind of what it's there for. Thank God we just had a baby. I have a purpose for another at least like 18 years. But
and congratulations.
Thank you very much. Thank you. So when people start controlling or attempting to control this drive through these systems, what are they doing? What are the impacts? What is happening in the body?
Well, that's a very critical question. If we talk about just estrogen, of course, there's other hormones involved like progesterone, testosterone, and everything sort of filters down to other hormones. But if we just focus on estrogen as the master hormone, so estrogen, a lot of people, doctors alike, view estrogen as just about reproduction, about having menstrual cycles and such. But estrogen actually has receptors virtually in every organ throughout the body. Estrogen is actually involved in almost every enzyme function of the body. There are estrogen receptors on every form of immune cell, like the innate immune cells, like mast cells and macrophages and neutrophils, and the T and B cells that make antibodies. So it's involved in the entire immune system. Estrogen is also involved in the heart. There are estrogen receptors in the heart muscle, the brain. The brain, every area of the brain has estrogen receptors. And then estrogen receptors are in arteries, in lungs, of course, in female organs.
And what is the pill doing to that estrogen functioning?
Well, it's very complex, but the birth control pill has no estrogen. It's really important that ethinyl estradiol is officially an endocrine disruptor. So by that, it means that it works and attaches to estrogen receptors, but it's not the same. It's kind of like a mimic, and it does not have the same effect. The other thing that you lose when you're on birth control pills is the rhythm. It turns out that we did not understand rhythms until relatively recently. And it's not just, for example, we know this with food we're learning, so this will help, resonate with your listeners. It's not just what you eat, it's how much of it you eat, and it's when you eat it, right? So if you eat all your food at 2 o'clock in the morning, it's going to have a very different impact than if you eat most of your food at 10 o'clock in the morning. We are totally different creatures. Our bodies are completely on timers. every cell in the body has its own innate clocks. And then there's in the brain, the master clock. Everything is timed. Insulin is timed.
Sure.
It comes out and it works differently. So basically, everything in the body is timed. Well, that's the circadian rhythm. Women have, and men do too, by the way, it's just not as obvious, but there's a lunar rhythm. And it turns out that there's this beautiful interplay between hormones and the rhythms and the quantities, which you completely lose when you're on birth control pills because you're not even having real hormones, which is such a big deal. But if you just talk about the rhythm of a normal menstrual cycle, there's this spike of estrogen, estradiol, right before ovulation. That spike of estrogen has amazing impact. It actually upregulates a tumor suppressor gene called P53, which actually lowers your risk of cancer, for example, breast cancer. It also increases the functionality of progesterone and testosterone and thyroid receptors. So they become more receptive because the receptor is not like a key in a lock. It's more like Jim Carrey's mouth. It's very dynamic. It changes. It's not static.
I don't think I've ever heard that analogy before. But for people I think this is a great, if anybody wants to go and actually do an online search of what a receptor really looks like, in pretend drawings, we have that kind of cup.
Yeah.
Where a little molecule fits into it. But in reality, it's a really complex protein structure that fits in your cells and kind of is living half inside and half outside.
Yeah.
I mean, depending on the receptor type, but they're connected. Mm-hmm. And so I love the Jim Carrey.
Yeah, so people know it's like it changes and it doesn't matter. We know that with insulin, right? If you have insulin resistance, you can have plenty of insulin. It doesn't matter if it doesn't work. In fact, that's one of the reasons why a lot of women on birth control pills have symptoms of low thyroid, even though their thyroid hormone levels are normal, because the receptors are not functioning properly. The same thing with testosterone and progesterone. And then when you have the progesterone that has its own little peak in the luteal phase, the second half of the menstrual cycle, that then downregulates the estrogen and testosterone receptors. So you have this beautiful up and down, this beautiful rhythm, which is completely lost. And this is very, very important for mental health. We know, if we talk about mental health, that women on birth control pills have significantly higher rates of depression. They also have, even in the younger age groups, higher incidence of even suicide that has been reported. Estrogen is involved in mood. And this is another very interesting area that I don't know if your listeners have heard about, but there's this amazing system called the endocannabinoid system. That's the system that, of course, cannabis or marijuana works on. But people don't realize that estrogen controls the endocannabinoid system. And estrogen is actually considered an anxiolytic. Estrogen lowers anxiety, and it actually seems to do that through the endocannabinoid system.
And so endocannabinoids are involved in immune, they're involved
everything,
in gut regulation. I mean, so many different things, right?
It's huge. And actually, it sort of parallels the endocannabinoid system sort of parallels the receptor functions of estrogen. It's all over the body. Like you mentioned, the immune system is related to estrogen and the endocannabinoid system and in the brain and emotions and pain, right? It's all interlinked. And when you have low levels of estrogen, you innately develop higher levels of inflammation. And we now know that on birth control pills, the gut microbiome changes and becomes dysbiotic, becomes abnormal. There are estrogen receptors throughout the entire gut. The lining cells, called the enterocytes, have estrogen receptors, and so too what's called the enteric nervous system, the nervous system of the gut.
Which are those there to detect extraneous estrogen that is coming into the body, or is there circulation of endogenous
it's all
into the gut?
It's all about endogenous estrogen. In fact, estrogen is so important to the gut and gut function that estrogen is made in the gut, in the Peyer's patches, in the lymphoid nodules, follicles. Estrogen is very key to male health, very key. But estrogen in a male is made on site in the organs themselves. We call that paracrine. So men, for example, make 6 to 8 times as much estradiol in their brains than women make in their brains. And women make up for that difference from their ovarian production of estradiol. But after menopause, or if they're on birth control pills, they have reduced production. And of course, in menopause, ultimately, and on birth control pills, no production of estradiol from their ovaries. The brain doesn't pick up the slack. That's why women have almost 3 times the incidence of Alzheimer's as men, because the brain desperately needs estrogen for its function. Estrogen controls the health of the neurons. It also controls the innate immune system of the brain, the astroglia and the microglia, which are the immune system of the gut, which act to maintain, homeostasis with inflammation. They clean up and that's why women, for example, who are reproductive, who have natural estrogen, they have normal hormones, if they have a problem, like if they have a stroke or they have brain injury, they have higher recovery rates than men because they have more estrogen.
Recovery rates?
But they do better. But and women, for example, will survive sepsis better than men during the reproductive years because women have more robust immune systems than men do.
Amen
But we do. And the reason is because it takes so much energy to run an immune system, and it takes so much energy for men to keep making sperm and to have bigger muscles, to have a higher amount of bone, and to have a larger status. So nature had to divide up. How are you going to split where you're going to put your energy, right? So in women, there's a ton of energy that goes into the immune system to fight infections. And that's so that women are more likely to survive an infection, whereas men are more brawny. A lot of their energy goes into creating brawn and strength, because let's be real. If you have a plague, an epidemic, if you kill off 90% of the men and 50% of the women,
we're still good.
You're still good. Exactly.
You still have housing for the new generation of babies.
Right. That's when you start creating harems, right? But
look, we know we're pretty. We know we're not as necessary for the
You're very important.
It's like just keep a few of us in test tubes somewhere and we'll be okay. No, I mean, that's so great to hear about and think of the implications of, again, kind of complex. We talked about the age of big medicine and science, and one side of implication of birth control and that relief kind of, and what I mean by the relief is giving women back some measure of control over the reproduction, which again, we come from a pretty patriarchal society still to this day. And so I think for a lot of women, having access to that meant that no matter what else was going on in their life, they would get a measure of control of the reproduction. But what you're talking about right now is the unintended side effects, right? We're back to the primary and the side effects of this. And that was not part of the intention. It may be something that nobody even knew existed.
But, it's amazing. Like there's data that came out of Scandinavia that women on birth control pills for just 10 years increased their rate of breast cancer, their risk of breast cancer by 40%. And women with the levonorgestrel IUD, which is an endocrine disruptor that's put in the uterus that has over 50% incidence of preventing ovulation, has like a 52% increased risk of breast cancer. And these are not little things. So the problem is that we didn't understand what we were doing, like the unintended consequences.
Yeah.
The question is it too big to fail? Can we really put what are really endocrine disruptors, toxins into women's bodies that are increasing their rates of anxiety and depression and insomnia? There was one study out of Belgium some time ago that showed after 10 years on birth control pills that women had 40% more plaque in their carotid arteries. Young women on birth control pills never develop the bone mass and the muscle mass that they are potentially destined to have. And the musculoskeletal system is not trivial. We need muscle, we need bone, and we're not women.
You get serious.
It's huge, and bone is a metabolic structure. We now know bone is much more complex than we ever realized, and we're not allowing women to develop the musculoskeletal systems. And in fact, women who have who go on birth control pills at young ages, before the age of 20, which is a large number, they actually may never develop proper function of their bladders, and they may not have normal sexual response because their vaginal tissue, their all their neurological tissues in that area, and also their bladders are not really fully developed. So the goal isn't to make women have babies every year. The goal is to be honest. I mean, nothing should be so big to fail that it's okay to put toxins into every single female to prevent pregnancy. Now that we understand that reproduction and total body health are completely one. They're completely interlinked. So we need other forms of contraception that are going to be maybe high quality barrier methods or something else that is not going to actually disrupt these critically important hormones of a woman's body.
Sure, and maybe put a little of the responsibility back on the men, right? I mean, for the last 60 years or so, the story has kind of been, are you on the pill? As long as you're on the pill, everything is fine. But again, that puts the onus directly on the woman to be the one who is in charge of it, as if, by the way, reproduction is only a female process, right? I mean, It's the survival of all of our species. It's part of how, I mean, obviously within my family, I don't look at my kids as the carriers of my genes into the next generation, but they serve that role too. But if we want to have healthy families and involved families, then sharing that responsibility, if you want to talk about it as a burden, you can talk about it as a burden, but sharing that in some way, especially now, right? Having the transparency, what I'm hearing is letting women know you can do this, just as long as you understand what the impacts are, both long-term and on your ongoing current health and mental health.
I know if you look at what's happening to women, the incidence of autoimmunity has really astronomically increased. Depression and anxiety. I mean, I see so many women coming in, and so many of them are on antidepressants and tranquilizers and sleeping pills, and much higher amounts than ever in the past. And fibromyalgia. All of these things are related to estrogen. We have so many now common conditions of women, and no one wants to think about it. Nobody wants to make this link. It's too painful. It's politically incorrect. But we have to do what's right.
So I have a question. I mean, this is something I know very little about, but I've heard for decades now about extraneously introduced hormones, whether they be in food or what do you know about that? And I mean, obviously that's something people have been worrying about for a little while, but
rightfully so.
Hormonal balances.
Well, I call it poison world. We live in chemical soup, and most of the actions that are negative of these chemicals that we live with now are actually acting as endocrine disruptors, not just on estrogen, but they can be endocrine disruptors for melatonin, for testosterone, progesterone, but estrogen is always key because estrogen is the master hormone in males as well. So what are all these chemical endocrine disruptors? A lot of people don't realize that lead is an estrogen endocrine disruptor. They say, why is lead so toxic? Well, it's not just directly toxic. It actually blocks the production of estrogen, the function of estrogen in the brain. And it can, in children, of course, it can lead to permanent brain damage that can never be repaired. In adults, it actually causes hypertension because it interferes with the role of estrogen in the arteries, in the health of arteries. And mercury as well, a heavy metal, is another estrogen endocrine disruptor. Flame retardants, plastics, phthalates, which are, by the way, lowering male sperm counts like crazy. They're linking male infertility and also environmental exposures like phthalates in women who are causing males to have hypospadias, where their little penises are not being developed properly. By the way, also Tylenol and Advil and ibuprofen can also affect male development, so we don't want to give those to women who are pregnant either. But these are actually, many pharmaceuticals are turning out to be endocrine disruptors. Metformin, which is given to like so many people, it turns out that's actually an endocrine disruptor. That was discovered by an environmental scientist at the University of Wisconsin, trying to figure out what the heck was going on with all the wildlife in the rivers and streams of Wisconsin. They figured out by process of elimination that it was the metformin that was going through the treatment plants. So there are endocrine disruptors taking many forms. And we now know that glyphosate, you've heard, of course, of glyphosate in GMO foods, and also the other so-called inert accompaniments, which are actually not inert at all. But glyphosate is actually an endocrine disruptor. Mold, you hear about like people having problems with mold. Mold is an estrogen endocrine disruptor.
Yeah.
So we are struggling with and BPA. Of course, every single person has BPA in their bodies. And pesticides, the organophosphates, are endocrine disruptors. So it's such a huge challenge. And by the way, they're now linking intrauterine exposures to endocrine disruptors to the onset of things like attention deficit disorder in children. Because remember, estrogen is key to brain development, and you only get one chance to make a brain.
Yeah.
So these are things that really, that's one of the things I do in my practice, is try to help women to be as healthy and toxin-free before they get pregnant.
Right. Yeah, I mean, that's one thing. I'm very lucky to have Sophie as a wife. I mean, while we're far from perfect, I think compared to the average family, our exposure to some of these toxins and some of the, environmental, like you talked about, chemical soup has at least been reduced. Let me ask you a question before we get to the final 5 questions that we like to ask every one of our guests. I mean, there's a lot of information in today's episode, right? And I guarantee that there are people listening right now going, holy shit. Wait, I'm driving in my car on the way to lunch. Fuck, what do I do? Right. So in a nicely wrapped, I mean, I get that this is a much more complicated discussion than what I'm about to ask for. And we will have a link to all the work that you do so that people can contact you directly, etc. But in a semi nicely wrapped sort of way, what should people first be paying attention to? I mean, obviously we talked about birth control pills and IUDs and things of that nature, but in everyday life moving forward, what should women and men be paying attention to in order to ameliorate some of these issues?
Well, let's do, we'll call it the foundational things, the things I call it the low-lying fruit. Yep. Everyone should have an air purifier, particularly in their bedroom. Okay? So we now know the link between air pollution and virtually every health problem is huge. I mean, it's linked to, you could put air pollution and then put in virtually any health problem, and there's articles published on it. Okay. The next thing is a water purifier. It's kind of scary, I hate to tell you, for those of you who think that you turn on the tap and everything is good. But there's a lot of things that are not taken out. Our water purifying systems are really designed to try to take out bacteria, not to take out pharmaceuticals and jet fuel and other things that people who live near fracking areas and so on.
You're saying jet fuel is not good for consumption.
No, I think it's an endocrine disruptor. Exactly. But there's crazy stuff, and we obviously we can't get into fracking right now, but there's a lot of things about what that does to the groundwater, and it is really frightening, okay? And then, of course, people who live near farms, like the people who live in the San Joaquin Valley, and the runoff from the pesticides and the herbicides that get into the ground, and the children there have much higher rates of leukemia and so on. So definitely a good water purifier. So air purifier, water purifier. And then buy food the way like your great-great-grandmother could eat, right? So if it comes in a plastic bag, if it comes from a factory, if it has words on it other than organic apples or organic stewed tomatoes, right? Do not buy it. I shop almost exclusively at the farmer's market. We get local produce, and we get it from certified organic, very fresh, just picked within 24 hours. Yeah. So food has lost its meaning for so many people. They think of it as entertainment. They forget that food is what gives all the magic ingredients that keeps your cells functioning, that gives them the raw material so that your cells can do what they need to do. So food is critical. It's very foundational to health. And so you need to have organic, real food. And I'm a very plant-based person. Maybe we can talk about my opposition to the keto diet in the future, but the gut microbiome needs polyphenols, those magical ingredients in fruits and vegetables that almost dance with the microbes, and it needs fiber. It needs fiber, it's food. We need to nourish and care for our microbiome, and that means a high plant-based diet. So, and it really makes me angry when people talk about plants and lectins, that they're evil. People in India lived with lots of beans and legumes for thousands of years. They had the lowest incidence of autoimmune disease, rather high fertility, we know that, and they also had very, very low rates of dementia. So these diets are very healthy, and so please don't think that plants are your enemies and beans and lentils are your enemies. This is really dangerous. And also that you should start your day with a bowl of butter is really not a good, healthy breakfast. So you really, we need some saturated fat. We definitely need fat. It's an essential nutrient, but we don't need a ton of saturated fat. Too little saturated fat actually is associated with depression. So you need a little saturated fat, but you don't need a ton. And too much, there's tons of data that a lot of saturated fat in the diet will give you impaired gut barrier function or leaky gut. So you want to have a whole foods diet with lots of vegetables, and you want to really get your body working well, you want to sometimes not eat if you meet the criteria. And that's another whole topic about fasting. I'm a very big fasting person, and time restricted eating, where you stop eating at 7 at night, at least most times, okay? Unless you really get into a regimented schedule where you flip your circadian clock on a daily basis, but most people are not going to do that. Sure. So, try to eat a good breakfast. People do fasting and then they start eating at 1 o'clock in the afternoon. That's not good. Eat breakfast. So buy real food. Try not to eat out of plastic. So try to eat out of stainless steel.
Really quickly, because this has come up for us before, but thank you for all those tips. That's amazing. And I think...
I know it's too many tips. but
No, you know what? It's, we need tips. But around fasting, you're saying finish your eating early in the evening so that you can eat again the next day and have like 8 to 10 hours of no eating.
Actually, there's really good data now that if a woman, and I focus on women, but I'm sure that this is going to apply to men, but for women who have a 13-hour fast from dinner to breakfast, not like late night to lunch. No, it has to be dinner to breakfast. They dramatically lower their risk of breast cancer by about 70%.
Amazing.
It's that powerful, how you can change your body by when you eat as well as what you eat.
So cool. I love this. Thank you so much for those tips. So much information. You guys, you're going to have to pause, rewind. Thank God the podcast app has like the 30-second rewind button, because people are going to have to rewind on this a lot. But I love it. So much information and lifelong health information. So thank you so much for that. We've got 5 questions we ask everybody, and I'm about to put you in the hot seat and ask you those.
Okay.
Ready? All right. So number 1, what is the best advice you've ever received?
The best advice came from my father. And he said, don't do it because it makes you money. Do it because you love it. The money will just come. Oh. You don't live your life just in the pursuit of money. Really find your passion and go after it. And, I totally have lived my life that way. And, I see people at the end of their lives. I see people across the ages and people when they're getting older, all they want is time. They want value. They don't want stuff. So don't spend your life just accumulating stuff, because I'm telling you, when you get to the end of your life, you're just going to want to get rid of it. And guess what? Your kids don't want it.
Holy crap, I love that. That's so great. I love it. Question number 2 is, what has been your proudest moment to date?
Oh my gosh, I have so many proud moments, and they really kind of deal with my children. Okay, but I'm going to focus on one that is more recent, and it's my youngest daughter, and she really worked hard against so many odds that it was unbelievable, and she decided she wanted to be a jet pilot in the Air Force, and she had no background in it. She never flew a plane, but she went out. Nobody believed she could do this, absolutely no one. But she did it. She did training. She ended up doing fitness classes. She did everything. And and no one believed, people put her down. It's like, what are you doing? You can't do this. But she wouldn't accept that. This is what she wanted to do. And now she's a lieutenant in the Air Force, and she is training. She's the number 1 in her class, and she's training to be a jet pilot. And I see pictures of her up, like high in the sky, where you have to wear, these crazy masks and everything. It's like I think, oh my gosh, this is my child. She is so brave and she is so heroic, and she did this against all odds. And it makes me feel like if you want it, like she did. You can do it.
Amen. Absolutely. And you must have done something right to raise that girl to be able to.
I don't know how I take credit, but she was amazing and is amazing.
Flipping that on you for a moment. Question number 3 is, what has been one of your most difficult moments to date?
I would say one of the more difficult ones was when I started my practice. So this was back in the 1980s, in the early 1980s. Very few women were in OBGYN. I was not welcomed into the community at all. I went into the doctor's lounge at the hospital, and it took me a couple of years to even get privileges at that hospital because they said, we have enough doctors, we don't need you. Of course, it's illegal, but what are you going to do, go hire lawyers? Finally, they opened the door and I got privileges. One night I was there to do a delivery, and I went in the doctor's lounge, and there was a picture of me on the bulletin board turned into a bullseye, turned into target. They had the rings and they were throwing darts, and they saw me as this, at that time, very young, and I was upsetting the cart, I was challenging things. The old boys' school was not working anymore, and I was the only woman there. So I broke down some barriers. I was in the first class that took women into Princeton University. I was in a class of like 500 something men in my organic chemistry class. There were like 2 women.
Wow. And
it was challenging. So I went through, I was like the early feminist wave. So they talk about like the Me Too thing. Well, I had my types of versions of that. So my getting in practice, and when I went out at the end of my residency, and I was the top resident in my class, and nobody wanted to hire me because they saw me as a negative. It's like, who wants a woman? And that's how I ended up starting my own practice. I said, what the heck? I'm just going to do this myself. So I faced a lot of uphill battles as one of the early women in a lot of arenas.
I'm sure, and I'm so glad you made it through and you persevered. I mean, it's kind of crazy to think of something like obstetrics being so patriarchal and controlled by men for so many years.
It's so different now, but I was like the very, very beginning of the new wave.
That's amazing. You gave us some tips, and you talked in it about how you take care of yourself, but what is your self-care regimen? How do you make sure that you're your best self every day moving forward?
For myself, I do try to walk the talk. I use the fasting mimicking diet that was developed at USC's Longevity Institute. I do that every 3 months. So it's 5 days of eating, but my body thinks I'm fasting. So I do that every 3 months. I eat, like I mentioned, only organic food. I've been dairy and gluten-free. I'm not a vegan, but I eat relatively little animal, both for myself and for the planet, because the planet cannot support tons of animals, as we know, raising animals for food. So I eat only animals that are raised humanely and so forth. So I try to eat really the perfect diet. I try to get enough sleep. I have areas where I need to improve. I sometimes take on too much work, and I need to get, areas that I need to do is to get more sleep. And I do try, I never, like I'm sitting right now, but I don't have a desk at my office. I stand. I never sit.
Desk,
the whole day I stand, and I try to walk, and I wherever I go, I take the stairs. Unless it's, I'm in a huge rush and it's like, 40 floors, but I try always to take the stairs, and, we have a little gym. Actually, my husband is my role model for fitness. My husband, on his second career now, is a fitness instructor. He is a certified fitness specialist. And we have a little gym in my office, and he does fitness assessments, and he does mine. And I have to face the facts. It's like, I need to get more muscle. So, we do fitness assessments, body composition. So, I have to try to walk the talk in all of these things. And I personally love guided imagery. That's my favorite form. I don't do meditation, although I encourage it, but I like guided imagery because to me it's so effortless. I get to listen to a beautiful voice and music, and it tells me to go to a beautiful place. I know exactly where in my head to go. It's a place I used to be when I was a child, and I can go there and I can really feel calm and do my breathing and so forth. So I try to work on my stress as well to be a role model. I'm trying to be a role model for healthy aging because I am aging. And, I want my patients to know that you can be fit and be anything, right? Up until maybe the last 6 months of your life. You don't have to be in this declining state for years, so we can be healthy and we can do everything right up until the very end when our cells can no longer replicate. That's true senescence.
Absolutely.
But we don't need to be in a declining state, long before that.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that. And, this podcast is called Ignited. I like to ask everybody, what gets you ignited? What gets you excited?
Well, right now, probably the biggest thing that gets me excited is travel to speak. So I am traveling all over the world. Just in the last year, I've spoken in Canada and Japan and India and Dubai and Oman and New Zealand and Australia twice. This month I'm going to the Philippines. Next month I'm going to be in London. The month after I'm going to be in Cape Town, South Africa. So I have been traveling and educating and meeting new people. So every time I speak, I don't have like one signature talk, as you can probably guess. Everything that has to do with women's health is my province. I do not like niche myself narrowly. It's like everything that has to do with women's health. And so I speak on many, many different topics. So every time I get a new topic, I have to create new slide decks. So I'm always having to learn new things because if I'm going to teach it, I better know it. And so it's just so exciting, this chapter of my life when I get to travel the world and meet people and speak and get to say my 2 cents.
I love it. I love it. Thank you so much. And thanks for all the work that you do and all the incredible tips for our listeners. I'm sure we will make some lives better by this episode.
Oh.
So thank you for joining us today.
My pleasure. And that's my mission as well. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Absolutely. Thank you, everybody, for listening to the Ignited podcast. We were so happy to have you along for this ride. Please go and subscribe to this. Leave us a review. We love hearing from you. And if you want more, don't forget to go to ignited.com, where all the podcast episodes are available with show notes and so many of the little details and links from each one of these interviews. And you can look at all the future events that we have going on, all the things that make Ignited so special, even beyond this recording. Again, thank you so much for joining us. We will see you next week.